Good afternoon, everybody. If you can hear me okay, would you mind dropping me a message in the chat box just to let me know? Yay, great, thank you. We had about 25 people or so that registered. Some, may not make it, and that's fine. But to just be conscientious of everybody's time, I'm going to go ahead and get started now at 12 o'clock. I first just want to thank you for being here and joining me today. My name is Courtney Sand, and I'm a licensed and board certified behavior analyst and a neuro resource facilitator with the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa. If you know me very well at all, you know that one of the topics that I'm very passionate about, learning about, teaching about, and infusing into my work at the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa as a neuro resource facilitator is ambiguous loss. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, both professionally as well as personally. And the overarching goal of my presentation today is to raise awareness of and normalize ambiguous loss after brain injury. Today may be the first time you've heard of ambiguous loss. I've previously given presentations on ambiguous loss from the perspective of the caregiver, but this is the first time I've presented on ambiguous loss from the point of view of a survivor of brain injury. You are navigating, if you're a survivor of brain injury, you're navigating these painful, confusing feelings that I'm going to be talking about every day, but you may have not known that your journey has a name, and it's ambiguous loss. So let's get right here. Let me make sure you can get in there. There we go. So we have our disclosure slide there. We have to include that. And always we want to make sure that we say that the content of our presentations is never intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, treatment. So always seek the advice of physicians or other qualified health providers with any questions that you have. And I will be monitoring the chat box, but if anybody, feel free to interact, ask questions, make comments. I'll have a couple points throughout the presentation. I'll just have engagement questions that I'll pose. Whether you just want to think on them and keep them to yourself or share, completely up to you. The learning objectives for my webinar today are as follows. So as a result of attending this webinar, my hope is that you'll become, oh, why does that happen every time? Hold on, folks. Without fail, every time I do a live webinar, it at least once decides to shut off. This is the world we're in though, right? Thanks for being flexible. If anything, over the last couple of years, that's what we've all had to learn, is being flexible. All right, so hopefully that's the one and done. I'm telling you, every single time without fail. All right, fingers crossed. As a result of attending today's webinar, my hope is that you'll become familiar with what ambiguous loss is, if that's a term that's new to you, and why it's unique to brain injury. You'll become familiar with how ambiguous loss affects survivors of brain injury. As I mentioned, I've previously presented on the point of view of the caregiver, and there's actually a recording of that on our YouTube page, but this one will be specific to the survivor's journey. That you will become familiar with the stages of grief, and that you will become familiar with the 6 guidelines of living with ambiguous loss and how to apply them. So I'm going to talk about what it is. And then I think the most important part, well, equally as important as just the awareness and education around it, is actual tangible tools that you can use to navigate the after of brain injury. So my hope is that as a survivor of brain injury, you'll walk away from this presentation with validation that your experience indeed has a name, and knowledge that will help you navigate brain injury and your ambiguous loss. And if you're a friend or family member, caregiver, professional, this information will be equally as important to you in your role. So let's talk a little bit about our society and how we look at grief. So our society's response to grief is an incomplete list. Our society accepts the need to grieve and publicly mourn a physical death, but we have very little understanding of the need to process and grieve somebody who is still alive, yet changed. Present, yet not. The you that you once knew in the before before brain injury, that version of you is gone. So it feels very much like a death, but you're grieving someone who is still alive, essentially a stranger looking back at you in the mirror. And when living with ambiguous loss after brain injury, as a survivor, you might hear things like, you should count your blessings, at least you're still alive. You should be grateful, at least you can still walk, you can talk. You should be thankful, at least you still can work. No one wants to live an at least life. None of us do. And when people at least all over you, you feel unheard, unseen, silenced, compared, invalidated, because you're still here, yet you're not. You think to yourself, I don't feel lucky at all. I don't feel blessed. I wish I hadn't survived. I wish they had let me die. I would rather be dead. And these are very raw, very real, very common ways to think and feel after brain injury. Because brain injury is often hidden, the impacts are often not visible to others. Aren't you back to work yet? No, I can't go more than 30 minutes of staring at a computer screen before my eyes get fatigued and I need to go lay down. No, I'm not back at work yet. Your kids must be so glad you're home from the hospital. No, I used to be a fun, playful, carefree dad, but now I get overstimulated with my kids so easily, and then I yell at them. There are so many impacts of brain injury that others don't see, along with the effects of ambiguous loss. And when those around you don't recognize and acknowledge your deep, deep grief and make you feel like you don't have permission to grieve this kind of unique, crushing loss, you are left feeling incredibly lonely. It is very isolating to go through ambiguous loss. That's part of the reason I'm so passionate about awareness about what it is, so that people know how they're feeling is unique to them and their story, but they're not alone. And it's not uncommon at all for survivors of brain injury to purposely self-isolate to avoid comments and questions from people who don't understand what you're going through. Our society assigns a timeline to grief, an unfair and unrealistic timeline. With grief, there is no timeline. There is no endpoint. It's talked about as though there is, though. And it's not something that you get to. Rather, it's a process you continually move through. It's not predictable. It's not linear. You don't move expectedly from one stage to the next. Grief is messy. Grief that lasts longer than a few weeks or months often looks to those around you, and you may have experienced this firsthand, that you're being self-indulgent, you're attention-seeking, you're dramatic, you're throwing yourself a pity party, get over it, to the world around you. Our society operates by a set of unspoken and sometimes blatantly spoken shoulds for how we ought to feel and behave in the face of sorrow as survivor of brain injury. And there is something called asynchronous grief. And quite simply, it's shared grief that is not existing in the same way at the same time. So within the context of a family, for example, family members will grieve at different stages and in different ways. And it's important to remember this in terms of the family system and the support system, as it can make navigating ambiguous loss that much more difficult and isolating, because you're all grieving, but in different ways. The messiness of mourning. It's like a fingerprint, grief. It's individual and unique. And your experience is a deeply personal one. Like I said, you're not the first person that's navigated ambiguous loss, but your story is unique and you're not alone. So be gentle on yourself. And as a society, we need to normalize the messiness of mourning and healing after grief. I always like to include this when I talk about grief. I think it's such a neat analogy. So I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. And I came across this a few years ago. I really like it. It's called The Ball in the Box. So there's a box with a ball in it and a pain button. In the beginning, the ball is huge. You can't move the box without the ball hitting the pain button. It rattles around on its own in there, hitting the button over and over. Almost any action triggers it. You can't control it. It just keeps hurting. Sometimes it's unrelenting. As time goes on, though, the ball will usually very gradually shrink and the pain button is activated less often. The ball hits the button less and less, but when it does, it hurts just as much. It's better because you can function sometimes day to day more normally, but the downside is the ball will randomly hit that pain button when you least expect it. In grief bursts, for lack of a better word, or it could be out of seemingly nowhere. You don't know what the trigger was, or it could be on something very obvious, like the anniversary of your injury date, for example. For most people, the ball never really goes away. It might hit less and less, and you have more time to recover between hits, unlike when the ball was still huge. It's not unusual for certain pain triggers to cause the ball of grief to grow larger for a period of time after you thought it had permanently shrunk. Name it and acknowledge it so you can get clear about what you need to cope with and heal it. So let's define ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is the loss a person experiences when there is a lack of resolution or clarity, no verification of death, or no certainty that the person will come back to return to the way they used to be. Pauline Boss was a pioneer in this field, and she first coined the term when she was studying families of soldiers who went missing in action in the 70s. Ambiguous loss is referred to as a relational condition because it ruptures relationships. And if you are a survivor of brain injury, you know this all too well. It's a coming undone from previous attachments in your life, an unraveling of attachments that you have. And it's not a grief disorder, it's a situational disorder. And there are two types. So ambiguous loss type 1, this is not the one that is specific to brain injury. That'll come next. So type 1 is marked by physical absence with psychological presence. In some, the person is physically absent from your life, but very much alive in your heart and in your mind. So some examples include things like someone that's gone missing, abduction, divorce, and adoption, military deployment, immigration, slavery, genocide, natural disasters, miscarriage, stillbirth, abortion, early childhood death, incarceration, institutional placement, gender transitioning. You can see that today we're talking about ambiguous loss in terms of brain injury, but there are so many ways that we just as humans can experience what ambiguous loss is. So I'm almost certain that on some level, we all can relate to what this feels like. Now, type 2 is the one that is specific to brain injury and other neurological diagnosis. It's marked by a physical presence, but with an emotional, psychological, or cognitive absence. So in some, the person is still physically present in your life. You're still here, but you're different. You're different emotionally, you're different psychologically, you're different cognitively. You don't think the same, you don't act the same, you don't interact the same with other people, or function, quote unquote, typically or normally like you did before your injury. Some examples of type 2 ambiguous loss include things like addiction, and you have to think about it in terms of that person is here, but they're changed. So if you're under the influence, you're still here, but you're not. Alzheimer's, ALS, Parkinson's. My dad has Parkinson's. So like I said, on a personal level, I also understand ambiguous loss all too well, where someone is here, but they're different. Dementia, brain injury, disorders of consciousness, mental illness, autism, workaholism, affairs, where your spouse may be having an affair. So they're physically still here, but they're emotionally disconnected. And then obsession with electronics. That's a newer one. We can be in the same room as people, but we're not really there. So for you, a survivor of brain injury, this looks like not recognizing the you staring back at you in the mirror. Essentially, you feel like a stranger to yourself. You think, I look like myself, but I get fatigued so easily now. I have no patience with my family. My short-term memory is non-existent. I don't have interest to do the things I used to love. You're grieving someone who is still alive yet changed, present yet not. Someone who is still alive right in front of you, but it's not the version of you that you know like, respect, or maybe even have patience or compassion for. And with ambiguous loss, there is an emotional death before a physical one. Ambiguous loss feels like you lose yourself over and over and over because you're constantly reminded over and over again of how you and your life are different now. And it feels oftentimes you're living a nightmare day after day, like you're stuck in the movie Groundhog Day where the same thing plays over and over. And you've lost something precious. You've lost you, somebody that you were before your brain injury, but no one has actually died. And with ambiguous loss, there's not a body to bury. There's not a death certificate. And it makes it very challenging to cope. So this complicated loss means complicated grief. And ambiguous loss is considered to be the most stressful kind of grief that there is because the loss is unpredictable and unending. I think that's important to remember too. It's also called having but not having, and referred to as extraordinary grief, frozen sadness, mobile mourning, as in you're constantly moving through your day, but it's always with you. Chronic sorrow, incremental death, unending loss, the longest loss, and the long goodbye. This grief is ongoing because the loss is ongoing. It's not going anywhere. It's grief that reaches into the past to what was and how things were before your brain injury, and then into the future to what could have been and what you imagined for your life. So for a survivor of brain injury, this might look like grieving things like once held future dreams of getting married, having children, finding a job that you love, going to college, buying a home, trips you plan to take, hobbies that you look forward to doing, and growing old with your partner. Ambiguous loss is without a doubt, it is absolutely devastating. And it leaves you feeling hopeless, paralyzed, and not wanting to inhabit this new life in the aftermath of brain injury. If I can't be who I was, I don't want to be here. Hear that all too often. The effects of ambiguous loss are crushing. It immobilizes or paralyzes individuals and their relationships. And this confuses the decision-making process. It freezes the grief process, blocks your ability to cope, prevents closure, which isn't even a thing, and leads to feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and exhaustion. The individual effects of ongoing ambiguous loss include things like anxiety, depression, you feel hopeless, helpless, identity confusion, not knowing who you are, anxious attachments with others, substance abuse, violence, and suicide. Ambiguity is the not knowing anything for certain. It's living in a world of shades of gray. And with ambiguous loss, this is the culprit. It's an irrational loss, so people respond irrationally. And it doesn't mean that there is a pathology, a diagnosis, a character flaw, a personal weakness, something wrong with you. It's the situation. Ambiguous loss makes you feel crazy. There's a name for how you feel, and it makes you have big, ugly feelings, and it's not your fault. Pauline Boss says you've lost trust in the world as a fair and rational place. Brain injury is not fair, and it makes no sense. So you're going to be left in the aftermath feeling as though something is wrong with you. There we go. We are, to a large extent, defined by the relationships that we have with other people, right? So we're a certain way with them, they're a certain way with us, and we're a certain way together. And when you experience ambiguous loss, you grieve who they were, as well as who you were in relation to them. So you miss yourself, you miss who you were before injury, your brain injury, and then you miss how your relationships were with other people. Ambiguous loss is a relational condition, like I mentioned. So it requires relational interventions, like family and community-based interventions, or the concept of community care, which we'll discuss a bit later. I always lose track of my mouse. It's like 3 different cursors here floating around. Okay, so this quote I like too. The healing power of even the most microscopic exchange with someone who knows in a flash precisely what you're talking about because he or she experienced that thing too, cannot be overestimated. As each of you know all too well, the primary impacts of brain injury are vast, spanning across many areas of functioning. Oftentimes we kind of clump them into these domains: physical, cognitive, and emotional behavioral. So with mobility, you might see range of motion, pain, migraines, issues with communication, vision, hearing, level of fatigue. These are usually visible, overt impacts of brain injury, and they're obvious to those around you. These impacts generally garner more sympathy and compassion than secondary, more hidden impacts. And so for that reason, secondary impacts of brain injury, like ambiguous loss, as you'll find, are not as easily recognized, understood, normalized, validated, or empathized with. With respect to ambiguous loss after a brain injury, a secondary impact is loss of relationship mutuality, the loss of a partnership. So whether you're dating, married, in a partnership with somebody, the balance has shifted. Things are and feel very one-sided now. You are no longer able to participate in previous familiar roles and duties. Things like being a two-income family, co-parenting together as a unit, being lovers, being best friends, being each other's confidant. You might have had to quit a job that you absolutely loved and gave you purpose and identity. You don't earn an income anymore. You're no longer able to financially provide for your family. Your spouse is essentially parenting alone because of your brain injury. So much of your independence is taken when you have a brain injury. You are no longer able to drive, for example, as you have a seizure disorder now, or you have PTSD from the car accident you were in. You depend on others to get you to where you need to be. The biggest thing I hear is that people feel like a burden, and they have a lot of mixed feelings. So they feel angry, depressed, jealous, bitter, resentful, guilty, shameful. And these are all normal and expected. Another secondary impact is self-identity. I don't recognize myself. I miss who I used to be. Who am I now? I used to be a professional businessman. I used to be a fully present, active parent. I used to be a confident social person. I used to be a dependable friend. I used to have faith in God, and the list goes on and on. Uncertainty is another impact, secondary impact of brain injury. If and how much will I return to my former self? As a neuro resource facilitator with the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa, I get asked this question all of the time, but there are no guarantees or timeframes. And as a result, as a survivor, you're going to fluctuate between hope and hopelessness. And then to add to the confusion, sometimes the old you may reappear, so to speak, where you have a day where you're just more oriented. You feel like you can get more done and your memory's sharper. You just kind of feel like your quote old self. So then you end up feeling frozen with uncertainty. So living this way leaves you feeling confused and distracted. You're hypervigilant and anxious and on edge, almost paralyzed, and it prevents you from being fully present in your life. Our minds can be a really hectic place when there's no neat and tidy categorization for a loss like this. We don't know how to navigate it. Having mixed conflicting emotions is another secondary impact of brain injury. Survivors experience a wide range of mixed conflicting emotions about this quote new person in their life in the mirror. Feelings like confusion, gratitude, jealousy, bitterness, resentment, betrayal, anger, guilt, hope, and hopelessness. Confusion because you grieve who you were, but you're also grateful that you're still here. And so these polar opposite conflicting feelings are very confusing. They cause a lot of guilt, but they are expected and they're okay to have. With ambiguous loss, your destiny, the future, it seems incredibly clouded, and it's often very difficult to see past tomorrow, let alone the next few minutes. And it really feels like you're fumbling your way through a thick, dark, unending fog. Things are not clear at all. You probably are somewhat familiar with the grief cycle. This is usually used in terms of a physical death, but it can be applied to how individuals feel as they navigate the grief of who they were. So we'll just spend a little bit of time walking through this. This is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's cycle of grief. And it's important to remember with brain injury, there is the survivor's experience of grief, their loss, the you physically standing in the mirror, not recognizing the person staring back at you. But then there's also going to be the grief experienced by the people around you that love you, because brain injury bleeds into everyone's everything. One of the quotes I like about ambiguous loss is, one of the hardest things to do is to grieve the loss of a person who is still alive. So the first stage is denial. And these are presented like first, then, but again, there is no linear, you start in the denial phase and then you jump all over the place with grief. It's not expected. It's not neat. So just keep that in mind as we walk through these in a sort of a linear fashion. Grief is not that way. Denial is one of the stages, and we pathologize this stage of grief. We make it be a bad thing, but it has a purpose and it can be very helpful. It buffers the shock of loss, and it sort of carries us through the first wave of pain, where everything feels like a bad dream or a nightmare and nothing makes sense. Denial helps pace our feelings of grief. It's nature's way of letting in only as much as we can handle. I think that is beautiful. And I like it because it softens denial and its purpose. We need the emotional airbags of denial to be able to sort of ease the impact and make the pain more bearable. Anger, again, we pathologize a lot of these stages, but they have a purpose. This feeling, this stage may feel never ending. And this anger feels much more intense than any sort of anger that you felt before. It often takes the form of blame, misplaced, directed at yourself, family members, friends, medical providers. That's very common. God, a higher power. At first, grief feels like being lost at sea and there's no really connection to anything. There's no anchor. Then you get angry at someone who treats you differently now after your brain injury, a family member who didn't come to visit you while you were in the neuro ICU, a friend who isn't around anymore. Suddenly you have a structure. Your anger gives you structure, and you will experience this anger, as will the people around you. It's normal. Bargaining is another stage, and it's often called guilt's companion. Bargaining asks questions like what if and if only. So you're willing to do anything to get life back to the way it was before your brain injury, rewind time and do things differently to prevent the accident, to negotiate with a higher power, make promises to do better and be better. You almost kind of get stuck in the past and you try to negotiate your way out of the hurt that you're feeling. Again, there's a reason for bargaining. It provides a temporary escape from your pain, and it provides you with some hope and gives you time to adjust to the reality of your situation. Depression. With depression, you might feel paralyzed, a deep, deep crushing sadness, emptiness, hopelessness, helplessness, loneliness, apathy. I love that picture. It's heartbreaking, but I love it because it shows the weight of depression by the rocks that are just filled from the top of that person's head to the bottom of their feet. This depression occurs as you become more aware of your circumstances, how you and your life have changed after your brain injury. This is not a sign of mental illness, that something's wrong with you. Rather, again, one of my many goals is to normalize this. This is expected and an appropriate response to this loss and the trauma that you've been through and are living every day. And the other stage is called acceptance. This does not mean that everything is okay. It does not mean that you are at peace with your brain injury. Acceptance is not an endpoint, because remember, grief is mobile. Acceptance doesn't mean that you've forgotten, because you can't anyway, right? Your brain injury will bleed into everything in your life. So it's unrealistic and impossible to reach some sort of level of quote acceptance. But it's normal and it's and expected to hate your brain injury. So I kind of like to conceptualize acceptance as recognizing that your life is going to look different now, and eventually imagining new options for yourself, where you're leaning into the present and into the future. So living well with ambiguous loss. This is sort of the third and final section where we're going to talk about goals for treatment and intervention. These are what the tangible tools that you can take with you for application, whether you're the survivor or you're somebody that's attending who loves and cares for a survivor. So Pauline Boss developed 6 guidelines for living well with ambiguous loss. And similarly, these are not meant to be gone through in any sort of order, nor is the goal closure or certainty. As I've said a lot through my presentation so far, ambiguous loss is not linear or predictable. So that is absolutely not the goal for treatment. The goal of these guidelines, according to Pauline, is not to regain your independence as it was before necessarily, but rather to stay resilient and healthy in a relationship with yourself that is now less than perfect, with a loved one who's physically present, but somehow changed. So in other words, the primary focus is not on how independent you are or not after your brain injury, rather a goal of taking good care of yourself mentally and physically while stepping into this new role as much as you don't want to and shouldn't have to as a survivor of brain injury with someone who is still here, yet not. The first of the 6 guidelines is finding meaning. So for each of these, we'll talk about what helps and what hinders. The first guideline for living well with ambiguous loss is finding meaning. Finding meaning refers to making sense out of a senseless situation. You, again, you may feel crazy juggling the way you're feeling, but the situation is you are not. So what helps? Giving the problem a name. Ambiguous loss. Once the phenomenon has a name, you can begin the process of navigating it. Just like with a diagnosis, there's something wrong with your physical body, and as crushing as it can feel to find out that X is, quote, wrong with you and you have a diagnosis, once you have that information, though, you can start to work to live with it, manage it. Same thing with ambiguous loss. Realizing that this journey that you've been on has a name is tremendously validating. One of the saddest, but my favorite parts of my job is the intake conversation they get to have with people, with new clients, where they invite them to share their story and why they reached out. And almost 9 times out of 10, they describe, whether it's the survivor that calls or a caregiver, they describe their feelings. And it's almost always the description of ambiguous loss. And I tell them, thank you for sharing your story with me. Have you ever heard of ambiguous loss before? And then I'll describe what it is. And it mirrors the description of how they've been feeling. And again, 9 times out of 10, the person weeps because they felt very alone, and that nobody else has felt like this. I have felt crazy. I don't know what to think. I don't know what to do. I am paralyzed. And finding out that, again, while your story is unique, ambiguous loss is not, in terms of it is experienced by so many people. So you're not alone. So that first step, give it a name. You realize that, again, it's not experience unique to only you. You're not alone. So what else helps with finding meaning? Talking with others. Support groups can be tremendously validating. Not for everybody, but it can be very validating because, again, you are hearing stories, sharing stories about people who get it in a big way. And all of these things, and I'm not saying these flippantly because these are all huge steps in and of themselves. Forgiving yourself for others, continuing but adapting family rituals and celebrations. Things might look different now. You might have been the one before your brain injury to kind of do the bulk of the Thanksgiving preparation around cooking the meal for a huge group of family members, but you're not able to do that anymore. So Pauline Boss suggests, finding a way to talk with families and friends and figure out how can we continue doing those things, those rituals that are so important to us, but adapting them in a different way. Maybe you come up with the menu and then everybody else, votes on what they want to bring and they prepare it and it's more potluck style. Again, it's just finding new ways of doing old things. And another very powerful thing that helps with finding meaning is something called both and thinking. Both and thinking is also kind of thought of as absence and presence not being absolutes. So both and thinking is a cornerstone in navigating ambiguous loss. Essentially, it's learning to hold and live with opposing truths in one's mind at the same time in absence of answers, pairing them together, holding them together. So this sounds like we can both hold on and let go. I can be both absolutely terrified and I can also be brave. I am both thankful I survived and I'm grieving who I was before my brain injury. So gratitude and grief, these opposing feelings don't cancel each other out. They can exist side by side. So in other words, you can and you should hold gratitude and hope in one hand, and you can hold uncertainty and doubt and grief and anger in the other. You can make space for both. This kind of thinking will give you the resiliency to move forward even while ambiguity persists. So you may be telling yourself, I need to focus, well, others may be telling you this too. I need to focus on the positive and not let the grief penetrate through. This is not possible, nor is it required. Strength is going to emerge not from holding on to one truth, but holding on to many possibilities. I am both ashamed that my wife is now my caregiver, and I'm thankful that she is in my life to help take care of me. I am both saddened about my lost hopes and dreams, and I'm happy about some new plans ahead. I am both a survivor of brain injury, and I have value. I am both thankful that I am still alive and sometimes wish that I had not survived. I must find a way to both hold on and let go. I am both hurting and I am healing. You can see it as, as I sort of say those out loud, that our society really tries to make us hold on to one of those at the same time. You can do both. You should do both. So one of the whether this is just rhetorical and you just think on it, or you actually want to type it into the chat box, totally up to you. Curious if any of you out there, whether you're a survivor or a caregiver, if you have any examples of both and thinking that you've learned about yourself and adopted that have healing value. One thing that I did or that I can share, my grandpa died, is it 3 years already, of a second of 2 strokes and a rare form of ALS. So I lived with navigating ambiguous loss with him and helping be his caregiver. And one thing I had to learn was I can be both a helpful, loving granddaughter, and I can set limits on how long I'm at the skilled nursing facility, and come home and be with my family and take care of myself. I was able to come to that realization. This is not something that happens overnight. It takes a lot of work to work on both and thinking. And I had my first and only 2 panic attacks, one of which that put me in the hospital during that time because I put just crushing guilt on myself as somebody who was caring for somebody with a brain injury, because I wasn't able to hold 2 truths at the same time. I felt like I was only a good person. I was only a good granddaughter if I pushed myself to the limit and stayed there as many hours as he needed me to every day. But when I finally realized I could be both, that was incredibly healing. Finding meaning. So what hinders this? Things like seeking revenge, retribution, heavy, weighty family secrets, isolation, seeking closure. So essentially things that are toxic, that are not going to contribute to a path of healing, right? Adjusting mastery. This is the second guideline in helping navigate ambiguous loss. Adjusting mastery refers to increasing one's ability to live with the ambiguity and decreasing one's need for fixing or solving the problem. Easier said than done, right? So our culture, Western culture, is mastery oriented. We strive to control everything in our lives to the best of our ability. We are a can-do society for sure, focused on answers and solutions. Ambiguous loss takes this out of our hands completely. The more mastery-oriented we are, the harder time we will have with a problem with no solution. Brain injury does not have one. You can manage it, you can live well with it, but there is not a solution. Conversely, in other non-Western countries, mourners will regularly speak to their dead ancestors, for example. So one study in particular demonstrated that the bereaved there recovered more quickly from loss than bereaved Americans. So with respect to grief and mourning, the American ethic is to sort of muscle through and suppress, avoid, stay busy, distract. And then we fool ourselves into thinking we're healing and being productive. So what helps? Recognizing that the world is not always fair. And again, these are not overnight concepts. You will work for a long time on these. Decreasing self-blame, externalizing blame. So the culprit, the thing to blame, is the ambiguity. And mastering one's internal self. That can look as simple as doing a 10-minute daily reset, for example, where you literally set a timer for 10 minutes, and then you give yourself 10 minutes of undivided attention, being fully present in the moment, with no expectations of yourself, simply engaging in an activity that's relaxing to you. Could be just listening to soothing music, journaling, literally just sitting and looking out the window, meditating, praying, drinking a warm cup of tea, whatever brings you sort of a cozy, calm, centered sort of feeling. Start there. So while you cannot control the loss that you've had at hand, you can control your reaction to it by engaging in helpful, mindful practices. What hinders adjusting mastery? Things like believing that you have somehow failed if you're not over it. And people around you, because that's how our society operates in the face of grief, will make you feel like you need to get over it. The expectation that we can be immersed in grief and loss daily and not be touched by it in a huge way is as unrealistic as expecting somebody to walk through a rainstorm without an umbrella and not get wet. You are going to carry your brain injury in and across every day, and you're going to feel it. It's not something that you can set down. It's okay if you thought you were better, that you thought you were fine, that you were making progress in rehab, that you were becoming more patient with your kids, and then you were hit unexpectedly with a giant wave of grief. It's okay if you thought you had everything under control, just to realize that you don't. None of us do in terms of navigating this kind of grief. Another truth that is okay to talk about is how you're feeling, what you're experiencing, and the death of the you that you once knew. That version of you lived and mattered. Honor that. Remember that. You may have seen it in person on display before COVID or even online. And something that we have that's called unmasking brain injury, where we've had survivors decorate a plain white mask with no expectations other than tell your story, in this artistic, visible way. And a lot of survivors' masks tell a story about who they were before their brain injury, in addition to who they are now. It's really important to give that person a voice and to honor that. That's part of who you still are. You're not that version of you anymore, but you need to honor that version of you. Rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. So this is a sort of a nice segue into the third guideline of reconstructing identity. So what helps? Reconstructing identity refers to seeing oneself in a new way now that that previous version of you is missing, essentially. Following a massive and confusing loss like brain injury, your identity is going to be shaken. So what helps reconstruct your identity? Finding a psychological family, or as I've heard somebody say, and I love this, framily. So friends, family, your family does not have to be made of blood that you share. Be friends, coworkers, people in a support group that's virtual that you've never met. Find your psychological family. Grief and mourning does not have to be and shouldn't be something that you experience and do in the privacy of your inner life by yourself. Our society tells us, though, that it's not appropriate to be vulnerable in front of other people. So we hold each other at a distance. And it's just, COVID has made that even more difficult. I mentioned the concept of community care earlier on in my presentation. Community care, if you've not heard of it before, addresses the fact that humans are naturally cooperative. People need people. We need each other, and we need each other to psychologically persevere and be resilient. I dug until I found me. I think that gives me goosebumps when I read it out loud. I think it's heartbreaking but beautiful. What hinders this reconstruction of your identity? Not wanting to change who you are and not wanting to change what you do. And that's okay. That's going to be part of this ongoing process. I hate the new me. I don't want to live like this. I don't want to learn how. I don't want to learn how to do this thing differently because I can't do it the way I did before. Reconstructing your post-brain injury identity is easier said than done. It's an ongoing process. Brain injury and grief don't have to master your identity. It doesn't have to be the first thing in line when you introduce yourself. You're more than your brain injury. You're more than what happened to you. You're more than how your life has been changed. You're more than your grief. It seems all-consuming, but you're more than those things. The fourth guideline is normalizing ambivalence. Normalizing ambivalence refers to tolerating the tension of mixed, conflicting emotions. So what helps? Normalizing anger and guilt. Those are okay. I tell my clients, I tell myself, I tell my 8 and 6-year-old, feeling like an angry volcano if you're going to explode, feeling anger, feeling guilt. There is nothing wrong with feelings. Feelings are fine, but it's what we do with them, right? So normalize anger that comes with brain injury. Obviously not the harmful actions that hurt yourself or others. And then seeing conflicted feelings as normal. With my grandpa, many times while I was sitting in his skilled nursing facility, he might have been hallucinating or he was disoriented or just really struggling. Either there with him in my head or crying on the way home, I would pray that his suffering would end. But I was also at the same time thankful that he had survived his first brain injury. And I've had caregivers, I've had survivors say these things and it's hard, and they've never said it out loud before, where, I'm so glad that they survived, but sometimes I wish that they hadn't because their life has been so hard. Or I'm so thankful I made it out of that car accident, but sometimes I wish they hadn't have revived me. Saying those out loud are scary and heavy and ugly, but they're normal. So normalizing those and seeing those conflicted feelings is normal. And then talking about your feelings with whether it's a professional, a friend, a support group, in whatever capacity you're comfortable with, whether it's in person, over the phone, virtually. Connect with people who understand your experience. That's huge. Recognize that it's both normal and human to feel your feelings. Again, your feelings are not right or wrong. They just simply are. Once you talk about them, it can be disarming and they become less powerful. Here's another, again, I just looked over. I've been so engrossed in what I've been saying. Thank you, Alexander, for sharing that you're a survivor and a victim. This is what I feel like every day. I'm so glad that it's validating. And I appreciate you sharing that very much. If anybody, and again, I always pose questions this way by saying, hold it in your head, have it be rhetorical. I don't care. Share it with the group. If you have any examples of mixed conflicting emotions that you have and hold, and again, these are often hard to say out loud, especially to other people, but even out loud to yourself. I remember the first time that I had told my mom, who is one of the daughters of my grandpa, told her that I'm so thankful, I'd say through tears, that he's still here and that I get to spend this time with him. But I also told her that I pray almost every day that God would just take him. And in tears, she said the same thing. So it is just, wow, it's powerful to be able to say some of those things out loud, but they feel terribly guilt-inducing. But just know that these are normal. That is normal to feel these things and to feel them at the same time. What hinders normalizing ambivalence? Denying or keeping secret that you sometimes wish it were over. Again, it's okay to hate the brain injury in the way your life looks now. You may always and will probably hate it on some level forever. And it's okay to have and hold those very strong, very human feelings and thoughts about your grief. This is the 5th of the 6 guidelines of living well, and it's revising attachment. So this refers to letting go while also holding on to someone. And in this case, the you before your brain injury. What helps? Recognize that you are both here and gone. You are still here. You may feel like a shadow of who you were before, but you are still here. And it's possible to deeply grieve the past and what you've lost and simultaneously celebrate and treasure what you still have. And you may not be at the point where you feel like there's anything to treasure, and that's okay. What else helps? Finding new human connections, sharing and connecting with others, not expecting closure. Remember, because there's no such thing. And that grief is a process you will continually move through, not to. There's no finish line. What hinders revising attachment? Namely, holding on without also developing new attachments with others. This can be incredibly challenging, very painful in the aftermath of brain injury. For example, you may be embarrassed to verbally speak during a support group because you have aphasia now and are very difficult to be understood. You may avoid hanging out with friends now because you are no longer able to drive and are ashamed to ask for a ride. You don't want to feel like a burden. You may be paralyzed at the thought of trying to date and put yourself out there because you no longer feel confident or competent in navigating the social stuff after brain injury. This is all very normal. Some of the most complicated grieving we'll ever do is mourning the life we should have had. Oh, that one almost makes me tear up when I read that one, because again, I think on some level we can all relate, brain injury or not. So this is the 6th and final guideline for navigating ambiguous loss, and it's discovering new hope. Discovering new hope refers to imagining a new way of being with or without, quote, missing person. In this case, you, the brain injury you, the pre-brain injury you rather. That person's missing now, right? So what helps? Being more comfortable with ambiguity, with not having the answers, laughing at absurdity, redefining your concept of justice. And these, again, I read these and it's almost ridiculous how simple they're worded because they're so the opposite of simple to do. So redefining justice. Bad things happen to good people. The world is not always just. We can intellectually know these things, right? But emotionally understanding them, completely different thing. Also, imagining new options. Give yourself permission to hope. New hope for the future can exist alongside old hope. That's that both and thinking. You can both have new hope for the future and be just in the most awful kind of mourning about missing who you were at the same time. Don't give up on this new version of you. Get to know what you need. You're going to have to figure out who this new person is now. You're not who you were before. Get to know what you need, how you're different. You are shifting. Lastly, another thing that helps with discovering new hope is feeling some control, even if the ambiguity persists and things don't go your way. Listen, feeling like you have some control, especially in the world right now. forget brain injury with COVID and the things going on with Ukraine and Russia and politics and on and on and on. I don't know about you, but it's hard to feel in control of anything. And then you layer on things like brain injury and mental illness. Discovering new hope is still feeling some control in your life, even if things don't go your way and that ambiguity still persists. And then what hinders this step? Isolating, insisting on always having the answer, because we won't, and then seeking closure instead of meaning. Again, because closure is not even a thing. So that's not even a word. And in the end, it's you against you fighting for yourself. I thought that was just perfect for survivors, because really that's what it's going to come down to. You can have the best army of supporters around you, but at the end of the day, it really is you against you. And then I'll kind of end with this last quote here. I had my own notion of grief. I thought it was the sad time that followed the death of someone you love, and you had to push through it to get to the other side. But I'm learning that there is no other side. There is no pushing through, but rather there is absorption. Oh, I just get goosebumps with that word. There's absorption, adjustment, acceptance, shifting. And grief is not something you complete, but rather you endure. Grief is not a task to finish and move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being, a new way of seeing, a new definition of self. I think that is so beautiful. I think it really does a lovely job of walking through those stages of grief and really highlighting that grief is it's not linear. It's not something we get to. You will always be navigating this grief. It lives in your everyday. It's not going anywhere, but it's that shifting, the absorption, redefining hope, looking towards the future, leaning into tomorrow. Of course, bibliography, some resources that I pulled from there. And then, yes, thank you. Seriously, thank you. I am always humbled when I get to speak to survivors, caregivers, family, friends, professionals, anybody that's living with, working with, supporting people with brain injury. So I appreciate your time today, and I hope that whatever your role is, or for whatever reason that you came today, that you, at the very least, especially you survivors, feel heard and seen, and that your journey is normalized and validated. And know that also too, you can reach out to the Brain Injury Alliance if you have not already connected with us anytime. You can call, you can email us. Our website even has a chat function, and you can get connected to somebody who can help you navigate life after brain injury. It is not something you have to do by yourself. You do not get a book on how to live through brain injury and know what to ask and what to say and which words to use and who to call and on and on. We're here to help you do that, meet you where you're at. And there are also, therapists. We keep a list at the Brain Injury Alliance, therapists in Iowa who have experience working with brain injury. And not only that, experience with ambiguous loss. So they really get it. So if you're somebody who's looking for a support group, a therapist, a neuro resource facilitator to help you navigate this, please reach out. And again, thank you. And I hope that you all walked away with tools, validation. I'll keep this up for a few minutes if you need to jot down anything. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you might have heard the beginning of the webinar said, this session is now being recorded. We try to record all of our webinars. This one was recorded, and I will have it uploaded and shared to our YouTube page here in the next few days. So you'll be able to access that at any time. So let me know if you have any questions. Thank you again, everybody. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.